He was 2 hours late to his own company's anniversary, but the only person still waiting was her. What happens when the man who built an empire realizes he no longer remembers why he built it in the first place? Richard Callahan was a self-made millionaire, polished in public and haunted in private. Behind the glossy headlines and boardroom victories was a man quietly unraveling, estranged from his family, distant from his past, and too proud to admit he was lost. And Evelyn Moore. She was never meant to matter, just a secretary, just a support. But sometimes the person holding your calendar is also holding your compass. Imagine being the one left behind not once, but over and over, and still choosing to stay. What would you do if you were her? This is a story about second chances, quiet promises, and a love that found its way through the spaces no one else noticed. If this touches something in you, we invite you to stay, feel, and reflect with us. Share your thoughts in the comments. Your story might help someone else heal. And now, let us take you back to the night he didn't show up. He was supposed to give a speech that night, but the only voice left in the banquet hall was silence. The soft chime of a grandfather clock echoed faintly through the grand dining hall of the Maple Ridge Inn, nestled by the quiet shores of Lake Champlain. Outside, the autumn air had turned crisp, pushing amber leaves to dance across the gravel driveway as headlights cut through the night. Inside, the table linens had been smoothed, the crystal glasses emptied, and the centerpiece candles burned low, flickering like memories fading at the edges. Richard Callahan arrived late, more than 2 hours late. His black SUV pulled up just as the valet was preparing to close for the night. He stepped out with the posture of a man used to running entire rooms without speaking a word. His navy suit still sharp, though the tie had been loosened, and his eyes, those gray-blue eyes that once brimmed with fire, looked almost apologetic now. The 20th anniversary of Callahan Pure had been planned for months, held in this charming lakeside venue with its polished wood floors and stone fireplaces. There were speeches scheduled, photo boards of the company's early days, a slideshow featuring testimonials from loyal customers and past employees. He was supposed to speak last, the closing remarks, the heart of the evening, but the shareholders' emergency session had run long too long, and now the room looked like the ghost of a celebration. Empty chairs scattered around linen-covered tables, champagne flutes with lipstick stains, name tags abandoned. The music had stopped, and the only sound left was the subtle hum of the heaters and the occasional creak of wood shifting under old age. And yet, someone remained. She sat near the back of the room, beneath one of the tall bay windows that overlooked the lake. A flicker of candlelight caught the curve of her shoulder as she stood. "Evelyn," he said softly, not quite surprised. She wore a simple navy blue dress, modest but elegant, with a thin gray shawl around her arms. Her dark chestnut hair was loosely pinned, strands curling down against her neck. On the table beside her sat a leather-bound notebook and a half-finished glass of wine, long since gone warm. "I thought you might still come," she said, her voice calm, but not without weight. Richard loosened his tie further and let out a breath, scanning the dim room. "Doesn't look like there's anyone left to hear me speak." "There were," Evelyn replied. They waited for a while. Then the catering staff started cleaning. "I asked them to leave this one table, just in case." He gave a short nod, rubbing the back of his neck. "I didn't want to miss it." "You did." Her words weren't accusatory, just true. He looked at the chair across from her, then slowly sat down. The warmth of the room had long since faded. Only the low candlelight on their table still held a soft glow. She reached into her leather bag and pulled out something wrapped in a small piece of fabric. Her hands, steady and sure, unwrapped it with quiet care and placed it between them. A notebook. No, not just a notebook. Richard's eyes narrowed as he leaned forward. The brown leather cover was scuffed at the edges, and the binding had frayed, as though it had traveled far without protection. A small coffee stain bloomed in the lower corner, just like the ones that used to dot his desk back when he worked from a basement. His hands reached for it almost instinctively. "You kept this?" he asked, barely above a whisper. Evelyn smiled, faintly. "You left it on a shelf the day the company moved to the downtown office. No one knew what it was, but I figured it wasn't mine to throw away." He flipped it open. The handwriting was unmistakable, bold, uneven, impatient. He'd written this at 21, hunched over a borrowed desk lamp, dreaming of plant-based skincare and sustainable packaging, and believing wholeheartedly that people would care. The margins were filled with sketches, early formulas, slogan ideas, and on the front page, faded but legible, "Build with purpose, or don't build at all." He blinked. That line. He hadn't remembered writing it, but it pierced through the years like a whisper from a younger self. "I forgot this existed," he said, his voice rougher than usual. Evelyn didn't speak. She just watched him, her hands folded gently in her lap, as though she understood that this wasn't a moment that required words. For a long time, they sat in silence, not awkward, not strained, just present. The room had emptied. The decorations were starting to droop. The warmth of celebration had long since left the air, but at that small table by the window, something lingered quiet and weighty. Not regret, not nostalgia, maybe something closer to awakening. Richard closed the notebook slowly and looked up. Outside the window, the moonlight caught the surface of the lake in shimmering silver ripples. A wind picked up, brushing against the panes like a breath. He didn't know it yet, but this was the moment the world began to shift. Not loudly, not all at once, but enough for one man to remember who he had been, and just enough for one woman to wonder if he'd ever find his way back. What do you say to someone who knows the version of you that no one else remembers? The kitchen at Maple Ridge Inn wasn't meant for guests. It was a modest space tucked behind the banquet hall, its tiled floor worn soft by years of footsteps. Copper pots hung from wooden beams above the stove. A single table stood in the center, set with a tablecloth more practical than elegant. The cooks had long since gone home, but one of them, a kind-faced woman in her 60s, had left behind a pot of stew on the warmer and 2 slices of bread wrapped in linen. Evelyn carried it all with practiced grace, setting it down before Richard without asking. He didn't protest, maybe because he was too tired, or maybe because there was something comforting in the quiet act of being cared for without needing to deserve it. The overhead lights stayed off. Instead, Evelyn lit 2 candles from the counter drawer, placing them between them on the table. Their flames danced gently, casting flickers of gold across the old stone walls and their faces. Neither of them spoke at first. The clink of spoons against ceramic bowls filled the silence, and the room settled into the kind of stillness only found at the end of long days. "You were late," Evelyn said finally, her voice soft. "But I saved you the best part of the stew." Richard glanced up. "Didn't think you cooked." "I don't," she said, a small smile tugging at her lips. "But I do know how to reheat." He gave a quiet laugh, short, genuine, surprising even to himself. They ate in that calm, candlelit space, like two people who had known each other longer than they could quite define. Not through shared dinners or holidays, but through boardrooms, phone calls, flights booked at midnight, and the 1,000 unspoken rhythms of professional life. But tonight, something was different. "You ever think about the first time we met?" Evelyn asked, breaking a piece of bread in half. Richard took a moment to answer. "The interviews." She nodded. "You were hiring a new executive assistant, but half the applicants looked like they were auditioning for a finance commercial. Polished, perfect, slightly robotic." "I remember," he said. "You came in wearing a second-hand blazer and brought a folder of ideas I didn't ask for. They weren't bad ideas." "No," he admitted. "They were good, annoyingly so." She smiled. "You hated that I reorganized the whole HR structure in my first month." "I didn't hate it," he said, stirring his stew. "I just didn't expect someone to notice the night shift workers weren't getting proper childcare options." Evelyn shrugged lightly. "That was my mother once, working nights at a diner while I stayed home alone with a coloring book and a peanut butter sandwich. I noticed things like that." Richard Spoon paused midair. His eyes met hers across the candles, and something shifted just slightly. "You always notice more than you say," he murmured. "That's what makes it stick." The candlelight cast soft shadows on the table, the kind that smoothed out the hard lines in his face. He looked less like a CEO and more like a man who'd been carrying too much for too long. "I used to believe I was building something good," he said suddenly. "Not just profitable good, the kind of company Anne and I dreamed of. Sustainable, ethical, local, something that made the world even a little better." Evelyn didn't reply. She simply watched him as he spoke, with the kind of attention that feels like silence leaning in. Then came the investors. He continued, voice low. "The scaling, the distribution deals. One by one, we compromised. I told myself it was temporary, just until we hit the next milestone. But somehow, we never came back." He wasn't sure why he said all of it out loud. Maybe because the room felt safe. Maybe because she had always listened without judgment. Or maybe because Evelyn Moore had never once asked for anything from him, but tonight. She had given him something he didn't know he needed. "I think about that young man sometimes," Evelyn said gently. "The one who stayed up all night melting beeswax and writing vision statements on napkins. He had heart. You still do, you know. It's just quieter now." Richard looked down, fingers brushing over the notebook she'd given him earlier, the splotched leather, the warped edges, the youthful scrawl. And then her voice came, quiet but unwavering. "Do you miss who you were back then?" It was a simple question, but it landed like a stone dropped into deep water, rippling, reaching places he hadn't touched in years. He didn't answer right away. The candle between them flickered. A breeze pushed faintly through the window pane. Somewhere outside, a loon called across the lake, low and mournful. Richard turned the notebook in his hands and slowly opened it again. Page after page of ink-stained ideas, formulas, dreams, and then a torn page near the end, not neatly ripped, but hastily removed, a jagged edge where something once existed, but was now gone. He traced the roughness with his thumb. The page had never been replaced. Some dreams, he realized, had been abandoned before they were ever completed. He didn't say anything more. Evelyn didn't press. The quiet between them felt full, not empty, like an inhale waiting to become an exhale. Sometimes the loudest emotions live in the things we never say aloud. The office lights had always bothered him. Too white, too bright, no warmth, like the sterile glow of a hospital waiting room, but Richard Callahan had never bothered to change them. He had other priorities. He always did. After the anniversary dinner, the world had resumed its usual pace, fast, calculated, predictable, or at least, it tried. But Richard felt something had shifted imperceptibly, like the tilt of the earth just before the seasons change. A quiet unease, a kind of remembering that followed him from his lakeside dinner with Evelyn back into the polished halls of Callahan Pure. It began with the notebook. He kept it now in the top drawer of his desk, where once only contracts and acquisition folders lived. Some days he didn't open it. Others, he would flip to a random page, run his finger over the margin doodles, and imagine the version of himself who had believed so fully in simplicity. Anne had believed in him, too. Back then. They were just 24 when they started melting wax in his parents' garage. She'd bring in herbs from her garden. He'd mix them with oils and label them by hand. Their first batch of lavender balm had been sold at a farmer's market on a fold-up table with a hand-drawn sign. That night, they'd driven home under a sky full of stars and counted the $22 they'd made as though it were a fortune. He'd loved her more than success, but success had come anyway. And slowly, quietly. It had asked for more than he'd meant to give. By the time Callahan Pure had its first big-box retail deal, they were no longer laughing over herbs and handmade jars. They were filling out tax forms in separate rooms. By the time they reached $10 million in sales, Anne had asked for a divorce. She had left quietly. No drama, no accusations, just a handwritten letter on the kitchen counter, ending with one sentence that still echoed. "I miss the man who used to make balm just to help my dry hands." Richard never replied. Instead, he built, hired, expanded, acquired, until the company was too big to see where it started. And Evelyn Moore had shown up in the middle of all that. She hadn't knocked loudly. She hadn't demanded anything. She'd simply entered the rhythm of his life like a metronome, subtle, steady, consistent. At first, she was just the assistant, organized, sharp, efficient, but slowly she became the memory keeper. She reminded him to eat before long flights. She had a drawer with every kind of tea he might need, but always brewed the same kind black, with 1 teaspoon of honey and a hint of ginger, just the way he liked it, though he'd never once told her that. When Clara, his daughter, had her 6th grade piano recital, Evelyn was the one who remembered to send flowers with a note signed, "Love, Dad," when Richard got stuck in a meeting across the country. She never brought it up. She never made him feel guilty. She simply filled the gaps life had left behind. One winter, when Vermont storms had knocked the power out, she'd waited in the office with him, flashlight in hand, reviewing a board deck by candlelight. They'd shared a thermos of soup she'd brought from home. He remembered thinking that night, "This doesn't feel like work anymore." But he had never said that aloud. Just like she never pointed out that he'd started pausing meetings at 2 p.m. each day, the time she usually brought in tea. They had lived years in the same orbit. She knew when his silence meant focus and when it meant exhaustion. She knew when to ask questions and when not to. She had an uncanny ability to predict when he'd forget someone's name before an event and have it written discreetly on a folded note in his pocket. Richard had come to rely on her without even noticing how deeply that reliance ran. And still, he had never asked her what she needed, what she hoped for, what she waited for. Until now. It was nearly 7:30 in the evening. The office was mostly empty. The cleaning crew hadn't arrived yet, and the city outside their windows had started to turn gold with the first hints of dusk. Evelyn packed her things slowly, methodically. As always, her desk was still immaculate. A photo of her mother by a garden bed, a pressed flower in a frame, a calendar marked not with deadlines, but birthdays of staff in small script. Richard stood in his doorway, watching her. She hadn't noticed him yet, or maybe she had, and chose to let him have that moment to simply look. She reached for her coat, adjusted the sleeves, checked the lamp, turned off her monitor. He wondered what her evenings looked like, where she went, who waited for her, if anyone did, and then she turned, caught his eyes, and offered a gentle nod. "Good night, Mr. Callahan." He almost stopped her, almost said, "Stay, talk, tell me what I never thought to ask." But he didn't. Instead, he watched her walk out of the glass doors, the click of her heels fading like punctuation on an unfinished thought. And then, quietly, barely loud enough for himself, he asked the question he should have asked long ago. How long has she been waiting? Building an empire is easy when you forget what it's for. The morning sun filtered softly through the tall windows of the Callahan Pure headquarters, casting warm light across the newly renovated presentation hall. Gone were the cold gray chairs and sterile walls. In their place, soft wood accents, muted green tones, and a row of wildflowers in mason jars lining the stage. The change wasn't Richard's doing, it was Evelyn's. She had been asked to lead a short internal talk, part of the company's new initiative to highlight socially driven projects across departments. It was optional, of course. Most thought it would be lightly attended. But by 9:05, the seats were filled, not with executives or investors, but with the people who made the company breathe: floor managers, packaging staff, new hires from HR, and the front desk receptionist who'd brought in banana bread for the occasion. Richard sat in the back, unnoticed, arms folded lightly across his chest, not with skepticism, but something closer to awe. It was the first time he'd seen Evelyn on stage. She didn't use a teleprompter. She didn't wear a suit. She simply stood behind a small podium in a navy cardigan and floral blouse, with a quiet strength that seemed to hush the room before she even spoke. "I grew up watching my mother work 16-hour days in a bakery she never owned," she began, voice steady. She taught herself inventory, payroll, how to talk to suppliers, all before YouTube tutorials or business podcasts. A few soft chuckles, but when she tried to apply for a small business loan, they handed her paperwork filled with words she didn't understand. She never went to college. She never asked for help again. Evelyn paused, let the silence sit. "That story isn't rare," she said gently. "It's common, especially for older women who raised children first and now want to build something of their own." Richard felt something stir in his chest. He had heard dozens of corporate strategy pitches, tech platform overviews, market penetration charts, but none had made him lean forward like this. Evelyn's voice never rose. She didn't try to impress. She simply shared her project, a training program for women over 50 looking to start small businesses, free mentorship, real-world language, local partnerships, flexible formats. It wasn't revolutionary in theory, but it was deeply human. And, for the first time in a long time, Richard realized how far the company had drifted from the kitchen counter roots where it began. He remembered Anne's hands stained with dried lavender oil, working late into the night to fulfill a 20-jar order. She used to say, "Success is when someone believes they can do something they were once told they couldn't." That was the kind of success Evelyn was building. When the talk ended, the applause was slow at first, then steady, then long. No one rushed out. A few staff members came up to share their own stories. A woman from accounting mentioned her aunt, who'd been afraid to start a candle shop because she was too old to learn Instagram. Evelyn smiled and nodded, scribbling down notes in the same worn leather planner she always carried. Richard stayed in his seat, long after the chairs were half empty, long after the banana bread tray was cleared. When she finally noticed him and walked over, he stood. "That was remarkable," he said simply. Evelyn tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, slightly flushed. "It's just something I've been working on in my spare time." "Not anymore," Richard replied. "I want to bring it into the company. Officially." She blinked. "You mean like an internal volunteer program?" "No," he said. "I mean real funding, resources, visibility, strategic priority. I want it on the executive roadmap." Evelyn's lips parted slightly, caught between disbelief and emotion. "I didn't think it was big enough for that." "Then maybe we need to change what we call big," he said, half smiling. She nodded slowly. "I'll prepare a proposal." "Good," Richard said. "But I want you to present it again, to the board, in full." That night, Richard sat at his desk and opened the notebook Evelyn had returned to him, the one from his 20s, with his earliest goals and ideas. On one page, a quote scrawled in young, eager handwriting: "Help people first. The rest will follow." At the next shareholder meeting, he cleared his throat just before the final slide. He hadn't spoken unscripted in years. "I want to take a moment," he said, "to highlight something we'll be piloting this quarter. A community outreach initiative aimed at empowering late-in-life female entrepreneurs." There was a pause in the room. He clicked to the next slide. The words, "The More Model," appeared in soft blue letters, with Evelyn's name just beneath. "For those who believe success isn't just about numbers," he said quietly, "but about returning dignity to those who were told it's too late to try." And for the first time in years, Richard Callahan felt proud in a way that had nothing to do with the bottom line. Trust takes years to build and seconds to shatter. The morning it happened, the markets opened quietly, just like any other Tuesday. Autumn light filtered through the glass walls of Callahan Pure's headquarters, touching every desk, every folder, every well-worn habit of the day. But by 10:47 a.m., something had shifted. A sudden flurry of alerts. A drop. Another drop. Red arrows blinked on every trading app. At first, no one understood. But then the headlines came. Swift, precise, and cold. Sources reveal internal debate over Callahan Pure's potential shift to chemical-based products. Callahan Pure may abandon its natural-only brand promise. Within hours, the story spread like wildfire. Stockholders called in a panic. Customers expressed confusion, even betrayal. And Richard Callahan stood still in the middle of his corner office, staring at the screen like it had spoken something in a language he'd once understood, but had since forgotten. Not because of what it said, but because of who it implicated. Evelyn had warned him months ago. In a quiet moment after a late meeting, she had shared her concerns not with accusation, but with the steady calm of someone who had nothing to gain by being honest and everything to lose by staying silent. "Richard," she had said then, "you built trust by doing things differently. If this company starts cutting corners just for margins, we don't just risk our mission. We risk our soul." He had listened, sort of. He had nodded, and then he'd done what leaders often do. He moved on. But now, the ghosts of that conversation echoed back louder than ever. And so did something else: suspicion. In the emergency board meeting, there was no shouting, no pointing fingers, just business logic, spoken softly like a scalpel, not a sword. She was vocal about opposing the shift. She's had access to every strategic draft, and she's not family. That last one wasn't said out loud, but it hung in the air. Evelyn wasn't a shareholder, not a founder. She was a hired hand, no matter how trusted. In crisis, the circle always shrinks. Richard wanted to defend her. Every instinct in him said she wasn't capable of betrayal. But evidence didn't care about instincts, and fear had a way of drowning out everything else. By the end of the meeting, it was decided Evelyn Moore would be placed on temporary leave, effective immediately, pending internal review. When she walked into his office that evening, Richard couldn't meet her eyes right away. She didn't come to plead. She didn't come angry. She came with grace like she always did, carrying nothing but a plain envelope in her hand and a quiet resolve in her shoulders. He opened the letter slowly, already dreading the words. But there were hardly any, just one sentence. There's a difference between loyalty and silence. I chose loyalty. He read it again and again, because it said everything she needed to say and nothing that could be twisted. I never doubted you, he finally managed, his voice rough. I know, she said, but doubt doesn't need your permission to enter a room. She looked around this office she had walked into every day for 5 years, the place where she had organized chaos, buffered egos, protected time, and poured invisible care into everything from strategy to schedules. I thought if I just did the work, if I kept everything steady, that would be enough, she added, more to herself than to him. Turns out, loyalty looks invisible until it breaks. He wanted to tell her to stay, that the board was wrong, that she mattered more than any stock price. But those words didn't come. And so she gave him a small smile, sad but free, and walked out. The next morning, her desk sat empty. Her mug was gone. The tea canister labeled E for Earl Grey had vanished. But Richard still had the envelope, still hadn't signed the official resignation, and still wasn't sure what to do with the silence she left behind. When someone is gone, you start hearing the silence they used to fill. It wasn't dramatic. The change crept in the way seasons do, quiet, almost polite. The tea station still stood in the corner of Richard's office. The kettle was still there. So was the jar labeled Earl Grey, though it was now down to the last few bags. No one had touched it. No one asked if he wanted tea. He hadn't realized how often she'd brewed it without him noticing. Until the first Monday morning, she was gone, and the silence boiled louder than the kettle ever had. The flowers arrived as usual on Wednesdays. Callahan Pure had always made a point of having seasonal arrangements, something Evelyn started years ago to reflect the company's values of staying close to nature, in tune with the earth's rhythms. But this week, the bouquet was off. Daffodils, in late fall. They were pretty, sure, but Evelyn would have never let that happen. She always chose what was right for the season, not just what was available. Now the scent in the room felt artificial, like a memory wearing too much perfume. Richard tried to focus. He buried himself in reports, meetings, crisis control, anything to drown the absence. But even his signature betrayed him. 3 times that week, he signed documents only to realize he'd mistakenly placed them atop the old leather notebook Evelyn had given him. It had lived quietly on his desk since the night of the anniversary dinner. She had returned it to him with so much grace, as though handing back a part of himself he'd forgotten. He never opened it again, but he never put it away, either. Like her, neither gone nor present, just paused. Each time he brushed his hand against the worn leather, his chest tightened. There had been no word from her since the letter. No email, no call. Not even a forwarded message about meeting minutes, as she used to send even on days off. He'd wanted to reach out. He didn't. What would he say? That he missed her? That the office felt colder? That even the walls seemed to echo differently without the sound of her quiet footsteps late Thursday afternoon? He overheard something in the hallway. 2 junior staffers chatting, not realizing he was walking behind them. She's in Maine now. Did you hear opened some kind of workshop, natural skincare stuff, teaching women how to make their own products? Sounds peaceful? Yeah, and bold. Most people don't leave a company like this and start over. He stopped mid-step. Maine. Of course. That's where her mother was from. She'd mentioned it once, years ago, while arranging his calendar. He hadn't known she still visited, hadn't realized that maybe she'd been building something else quietly while helping him hold up everything he'd built. That night, he sat at his desk long after the lights dimmed. He poured himself a cup of tea. It was bitter, too strong. She always let it steep just the right amount of time. He reached for the notebook. This time, he opened it. Inside were his earliest scribbles, visions for a company that valued transparency, sustainability, and people. Notes written by a man still full of hope, with no idea how much he'd eventually trade for growth. At the bottom of the first page, in handwriting that was not his own, was a sticky note. Don't forget who you were when no one was watching. E.M. He didn't remember when she'd written it, but the moment hit like truth. He leaned back, closed the notebook gently, and exhaled. Then he opened his laptop, pulled up the flight search, typed one word. Portland. He wasn't sure what he'd say when he saw her, but he knew the silence had lasted long enough. She started over with nothing but hope and a few jars of lavender balm. The road into town was narrow and lined with golden trees, their leaves beginning to curl into the amber tones of early October. The sun hung low, casting a soft haze over the hills of rural Maine. Richard hadn't been back to a small town in years, not since before the company took off, before the quarterly reports, before the board meetings and the sleepless nights. Now he was following a hand-painted wooden sign at a fork in the road, Moore and Earth, natural skincare. Workshops daily. He slowed the rental car and turned left. The workshop was modest weathered shingles, large windows, and a handmade sign nailed above the door, slightly crooked but charming. But the moment he stepped out of the car, he was wrapped in a different kind of silence than the one that haunted his office. This wasn't the silence of absence. This was the hush of presence, of peace. The air smelled of lavender and citrus. Somewhere inside, someone laughed. Not the polished laugh of a networking event, but something real, round, warm. He stepped closer and saw a group of women gathered around a wooden table beneath a wide window, hands busy stirring melted wax and oils in copper bowls. There were jars on the shelves behind them, neatly labeled in Evelyn's handwriting: calendula balm, rosemary cream, lavender sleep salve. And there she was, hair pinned loosely, apron dusted with dried petals, standing near the back shelf arranging labels. She turned before he could call her name, and smiled. "I wondered when you'd come," Evelyn said softly, wiping her hands on a linen towel. There was no shock in her expression, no alarm, just knowing. He blinked, unsure of what to say. "I saw the tea blend you launched," she added, motioning toward a basket of sample packs near the door. "You remembered the steeping time." A pause. Then she stepped toward him and tilted her head, not accusing, not cautious. "Did you come for answers," she asked, "or for peace?" The question landed like a feather and a stone. He didn't answer, not yet. She offered him a stool at the long table. He sat, watching her instruct the women as they poured the liquid balm into tiny glass jars. The workshop smelled like healing, not the artificial kind sold in glass towers under bright lights, but something older, truer. She moved like she belonged here. No title, no corner office, but more whole than he'd seen her in years. When the workshop session ended, The women filed out, offering gentle smiles as they passed him. One of them, a woman in her 60s with silver braids, touched Evelyn's shoulder before leaving. "You've built something beautiful here," Richard said quietly, once they were alone. "I didn't build it for beauty," Evelyn replied. "I built it because too many women kept telling me they didn't feel useful after a certain age." She paused, then looked him in the eye. "I needed to remember that usefulness doesn't have to look like exhaustion." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the old leather notebook, the same one she had returned to him. But this time, it was different. He held it out. She didn't take it at first. "It's yours," he said gently. "But I added something." She opened to the last page where the torn edge once lived and found a new sheet, neatly pressed in. His handwriting was slower now, less perfect, but honest. What matters is not who waited, but who finally came back. She looked up, eyes soft, unreadable. "It took me too long," he admitted, "but I'm here." They stood in silence for a while. Not awkward, not unfinished, just full. The wind outside rustled through the trees. Somewhere, a wind chime whispered against the porch rail. Evelyn finally smiled, genuine and bright, but guarded. "I suppose we'll see what you do with being here," she said. No promises, no sweeping declarations, just a door left slightly open, and this time he wasn't in a rush to close it. Not all proposals need diamonds. Some just need the truth. The attic hadn't been touched in years. Dust hovered like breathless memory in the sunlight streaming through a single, cracked window. Boxes stacked haphazardly along the wooden beams, filled with old glass jars, dried herbs, and hand-labeled notebooks from women who had come and gone. Richard stood at the foot of the ladder, sleeves rolled up, hands already smudged with time. Evelyn raised an eyebrow, amused. "You're not exactly dressed for lifting," she teased. He shrugged, a half-smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Let's call it atonement." They worked for hours, Evelyn, Richard, and 3 other women from the workshop. The laughter that echoed up the narrow staircase was unhurried and unpolished. Nothing like the controlled chuckles of boardrooms. Each woman, as they sorted through dusty crates and stacked wooden crates, slowly shared why she was here. Marcia, 62, once managed a chain of bakeries until a merger cut her loose with a handshake and a thin pension. Gloria, soft-spoken and gentle, had left her decades-long office job after a heart attack reminded her what stress could steal. And Lena, who had never been hired after 50, though she'd sent out more resumes than she could count. Richard didn't say much. He just listened. At some point between sweeping cobwebs and folding linens, Marcia turned to him, holding up a small jar filled with pressed violets. "Most people don't realize what we still have to give," she said. "They just see our wrinkles and move on." Richard took the jar from her carefully. "Maybe they're not looking close enough." Later, as the sun began its slow descent and the attic was nearly cleared, he made a quiet request. "I have an idea," he said, "but I'll need a little help from all of you." They listened, smiled, nodded. 2 days later, the rings were ready. Not perfect, not symmetrical, but they felt right. Silver, softened and shaped by hand. No diamonds, no velvet box. Just 2 simple bands, forged from kindness and shaped in truth. He placed them inside a small wooden bowl Evelyn used for blending dried chamomile, then waited. That evening, as the air cooled and the lavender field behind the workshop caught the last golden rays, he asked her to meet him in the back garden. Evelyn stepped outside, brushing flour off her apron. She found him by the row of glass jars warming in the sun, each catching the fading light like a jewel. He was holding the bowl. "I don't have a speech," he said, voice a little hoarse. "I don't have diamonds. I don't even have a plan past tonight." He took a breath. "But I have this." He held out the bowl. She looked inside. 2 rings, simple and worn already at the edges. Her eyes widened. "I've spent years building things too big to carry," he continued, "too sharp to hold. I forgot what it means to build something small, something real, something you don't have to protect, because it protects you just by being honest." A pause. Then he looked at her the way you do when you finally see what's been in front of you all along. "Let's build something small but real. Every day. Together." Evelyn didn't speak for a moment. Her hands trembled slightly as she picked up one of the rings. Then her eyes met his, and she nodded, tears catching in the corners but never falling. "Yes," she whispered. It wasn't loud, but it echoed. They stood in silence, fingers entwined, lavender brushing against their legs in the breeze. Behind them, the women in the kitchen began laughing over something, probably the cake recipe that never rose quite right. The scent of orange peel and vanilla wafted into the dusk. A wedding wouldn't need much. They agreed later that evening. Just the women who had shaped the rings, a few jars of wildflowers, and maybe, if the wind was right, someone playing guitar by the porch. They'd wear linen instead of silk. There would be no first dance, just a promise to keep showing up. Every day. Love doesn't need to be loud, it just needs to be lasting. The pine grove behind the workshop had always been quiet. Tall trees stood like gentle guardians, their branches whispering when the breeze passed through. The earth beneath was soft with moss, and scattered patches of late summer sunlight filtered through like blessings. That morning, a few wooden chairs were set up between the trees. No archway, no string quartet, just nature and people who mattered. Evelyn had spent the early hours gathering flowers from the garden lavender, sage, a few stubborn dahlias, and tied them with twine into a bouquet. Her white linen dress was simple, sleeveless, and swayed as she walked, like it belonged to the wind. No makeup, no veil, only a small silver ring on her finger. Richard waited at the far end of the grove, hands folded, a nervous energy about him that even a seasoned businessman couldn't mask. His suit wasn't custom-tailored, just a navy blazer over a crisp white shirt, sleeves slightly rolled at the wrist. When Evelyn stepped into view, time slowed. The pine trees held their breath. The ceremony began with no grand announcements. Just Marcia, who had once been a justice of the peace, standing between them with a soft smile and a voice like warm tea. "I've never done a wedding in a place that smells like rosemary and pine sap," she joked, drawing chuckles from the handful of guests. "But I suppose that's how you know it's real." Among the chairs sat Gloria and Lena, smiling through happy tears. Richard's daughter, Emily, now in her 20s, sat in the front row beside her partner, hands clasped. It was quiet, but not empty. When it came time for vows, Richard cleared his throat and looked at Evelyn, his voice low but steady. "I don't have perfect words," he began. "I've used too many in boardrooms and not enough where they mattered most." A pause. He looked down, then back at her. "But I promise you this, no more waiting, no more rooms where you sit alone while I chase noise that never quiets my heart." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded page ripped from the back of his old leather notebook. The final page. He read one last line, added only days ago. "You're not the chapter I missed. You're the story I finally chose to write." The air stilled. Evelyn didn't speak. She only stepped forward and took his hand, her fingers curling into his like the roots of the pines around them. Strong, steady, quietly certain. And that was enough. As they turned to face their guests, something unexpected happened. Emily stood, hesitated, then approached Evelyn slowly. The two had shared kind nods over the years, but never anything deeper than polite conversation. Now. She leaned in, arms wrapping gently around Evelyn's shoulders. Her voice was barely a whisper. "Thank you for giving him back to us." Evelyn closed her eyes. That was the vow that undid her. Not Richard's, not her own. But that simple truth, spoken from a daughter who knew what absence felt like, and now felt presence return. There was no first dance, no DJ. But as the sun dipped low, everyone gathered around the back porch, passing plates of roasted vegetables, fruit tarts, and lavender lemonade. Someone brought out a guitar, someone else a harmonica. The women from the workshop sang an old folk tune in harmony, voices cracked but beautiful. Evelyn and Richard sat side by side on the wooden steps, shoes off, toes touching the cool grass. Before twilight became night, Evelyn stood and walked to the edge of the lake. In her hands, she held a small glass jar no bigger than a teacup. She knelt by the shore and set it gently on the surface. Inside the jar, a folded slip of paper floated above a tiny dried sprig of sage. The paper read, "Sometimes all we need is to be seen and waited for." She watched as it drifted slowly away, the reflection of pines and stars dancing in its wake. Behind her, Richard joined in silence. He didn't ask what she wrote. He only wrapped his arm around her shoulders, and together. They stood as night embraced the grove quietly, completely, without applause, just lasting. The story didn't end, it just found the courage to begin again. The first check was only $500. It went to Lena, the soft-spoken former administrator who'd spent most of her adult life organizing other people's chaos. With the funds, she opened a tiny bookkeeping service out of her garage, offering tax help to small craft vendors who had always felt intimidated by spreadsheets. The second went to Gloria. She used it to buy new supplies for her herbal tincture line, expanding beyond the handful of mason jars she'd kept on a folding table in her sunroom. They called it More and More, a micro fund for women over 45 looking to start again, just as Evelyn once had. Richard didn't want his name on it. He said hers was the one that mattered. In the months that followed, the program expanded beyond Maine. Local news picked up the story. Then regional outlets. Then a brief segment on a national morning show. But Evelyn refused interviews. "The women are the story," she told reporters. "I'm just the reminder that it's never too late to start one." Callahan Pure, now steady after a turbulent year, welcomed a new COO with quiet applause. Richard had handpicked her a woman named Dana, who had once worked in product sourcing and treated janitorial staff with the same attention she gave to vendors. "I want someone who still walks the warehouse floor," he had told the board, "not just someone who lives in the spreadsheets." They offered Richard a seat as chairman. He declined. "Let me be the quiet voice in the room," he said. The loud one had its time. He kept only a small desk in a quiet corner of the building and a shelf where he placed the leather notebook. It was on a soft morning in April that Evelyn found him on the porch of their little house, steam rising from a shared mug of tea. He was reading through the notebook again, fingers tracing the pages not with urgency, but with reverence. "You know," he said, without looking up, "it's full now." She sat beside him. "Took you long enough." He smiled. There, between pages scribbled with product ideas and handwritten thank yous from women in the program, lay one last folded note. She hadn't seen it before. It was yellowed, older, her brow furrowed. What's that? Richard opened it carefully. The handwriting was unmistakable. Anne, his ex-wife. It had been tucked behind the back flap all these years, unread, unremembered, until now. He read it aloud. If you're reading this, it means you finally slowed down enough to notice what you almost lost. I knew one day you would. You always thought purpose was something you had to chase, but maybe it's something you recognize in someone else's eyes. I hope, wherever this finds you, you've found that look again. Silence followed, not heavy, just full. He closed the note gently, then turned the final page of the notebook. This time, there were two sets of handwriting. Hers, flowing and sure. His, careful but steady. Together, they had written. The story didn't end. It just began again. Not in an office, not in a meeting, but in the space where one soul waited for another to come home. Evelyn leaned her head on his shoulder. "You're not late anymore," she said, but he shook his head, gently. "I was, for a long time." He looked out toward the trees, those same pines that had shaded their wedding months earlier. "But you waited." She said nothing, didn't need to. That evening, as twilight stretched over the lake and the women from the workshop finished cleaning up for the day, Richard and Evelyn walked down the path to the dock. A small glass jar waited on the edge. Inside a sprig of lavender, 2 tiny silver rings, and the final torn corner of a notebook page. Richard picked it up and smiled. On it were just 8 words. He was late, but she waited, and that made all the difference. They set the jar gently on the water and watched it drift, slow and certain, across the surface just like time. But this time, they didn't need to chase it. They were already where they belonged. Sometimes we don't lose our way all at once. We drift slowly, silently, until one day we wake up in a life we never meant to build. This story reminds us that success means little without someone to share it with. That loyalty, often quiet and unseen, can be the strongest force in the world, and that even after years of silence or mistakes, it's never too late to return not just to a person, but to yourself. For anyone who has waited patiently, or felt forgotten, or questioned whether their quiet care even mattered, this story says it did. It does. And for those who've been too proud, too busy, or too broken to say what needed to be said, it offers this gentle truth. Redemption doesn't always come with a grand gesture. Sometimes it arrives in the simple act of finally showing up. In the end, love doesn't shout. It stays and waits until you remember your way home. Thank you for spending your time with this story. If it touched your heart, even just a little, please consider giving it a like, sharing it with someone who might need it today, and subscribing to our channel for more heartfelt stories like this one. Every click helps us keep telling stories that matter. Until next time, take care of your heart and each other.